Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth and final installment on our lecture on the integumentary system. So last few times we talked about the epidermis, we talked about the dermis, and we talked about the subcutaneous layer, which was not really part of the integumentary system. Now in our fourth and final installment, we're going to be talking about some of the structures that you find associated with the area of the epidermis. So these are all structures that are derived from the epidermis, but they're going to be found in the area of the dermis. So nails, hair, and exocrine glands of the skin are all derived from epithelial tissue, right? They're derivatives of the epidermis. So to make that point a little bit more clear, let me find an image. This guy here, for example, a hair follicle, right? So if you follow the epidermis up and down, woo, it dives down way down deep into the dermis. This tissue right here is epithelial, but it's in the layer of the dermis. That's what we're talking about. Here, sudoriferous glands or sweat glands are also epithelial tissue, but they're down in the level of the dermis. But the dermis itself is made of connective tissue. So that's just the point I keep hammering on to make sure you guys are clear about what's going on. Sudoriferous gland also goes all the way up and connects to the surface of the skin. Okay, back to where we left off. So first up, we're going to talk about fingernails. So what nails are, fingernails are, they're simply keratinocytes. The cells that make up the outer layer of skin, they're simply crushed together. That's all that it is, right? So fingernails are made of keratin. Keratin's made by keratinocytes here. There's just a slight change to the protein structure of the keratin, and they get crushed together, and that's where nails come from, and that's where hair comes from. So if we look at let's start over here at this cross section, right? We have a phalange, we have a finger bone, right? That's going to be surrounded by various connective tissues. This part from here all the way out to the edge, the entire bit of the nail, the part that's connected to the finger, the part that's inside the root, the part that hangs over the edge, the whole thing is called the nail plate. So the nail plate goes from here all the way out to here. Now, three regions of the nail plate. First, we have the free edge. That is the part of the nail that's hanging off over the finger. That is the free edge. Including the free edge is the part of the nail that you can see exposed from the body called the nail body. So the nail body is the part of the nail plate which is exposed to the outside. So that includes this portion here, and it includes the free edge. So the biggest structure is the nail plate, which includes the root, and the nail body. The nail body also includes the free edge. If we go back to this cross section, the part of the nail that's inside your skin, that would be inside this area right here, is called the nail root. So just to be clear in how these terms are nested inside each other, the nail plate is the whole thing. Then one sort of step down, you have the nail root. So the nail plate is equal to the nail root plus the nail body. The nail body has a certain section that hangs off the edge of the finger called the free edge. So the nail matrix is actually not the nail itself, but it is the epithelial tissue surrounding the nail root, which is creating the nail root. So the nail matrix is a thickened part of this epithelium here where the keratinocytes are being crushed together to make the nail root. And the whole thing is extruded. So nail is being created in this area, and as more keratinocytes are crushed together, the nail starts being pushed that way. And then you just trim off the edges of your free edge. So the nail grows from the nail matrix and moves distally or away from the nail matrix. Other structures that we can see here, your cuticle, right? We can't simply call it cuticle because this is anatomy. We have to have a fancy word for it. And the fancy word for your cuticle is your eponychium. So this is your eponychium, right? This is what your cuticle is. Opposite that, so here's your cuticle shown right here. Underneath the free edge, right, you have your hyponychium, meaning hypo meaning below or underneath. So this is your eponychium. This is your hyponychium. The fold here on the lateral surfaces of your nail is very imaginatively called nail fold. So at least that one is straightforward and easy enough. Now this little white area at the base of your fingernails and is most prominent in your thumbnails, what this actually is, this is thickening of the epidermis in this area. Because remember, the epidermis needs to be extra thick in this area because the epidermis is where you generate keratinocytes. Keratinocytes are going to get crushed together to make the nail. So this is a thickened layer of the epidermis. Remember, what are the basic characteristics of epithelial tissue? It's avascular. It's not vascular. So you're not going to see blood underneath, which means it's going to be whiter. It's going to be paler because you can't see the blood tissue underneath, which is why you have this structure here called lunula, right? Over here, underneath the nail body, right, you can see blood. So it's going to be a little bit lighter in color. It's going to be a little bit pinker, right? In the lunula, this is a thickened area of epidermis. So you will have more tissue covering that blood, so it will be lighter in appearance. That's what that structure is. Okay, I do believe I've covered all of these terms. Let's look at the slide just to go over it, right? Scale-like modifications of the stratum corneum, keratinocytes crushed together. The nail plate has a free edge, right? It has the pink part that's actually attached to your finger. That's the nail body. And the free edge, nail body, plus the nail root all together makes the entire nail plate. Nail root is the part that is buried inside your finger and is covered by skin. Right? A layer of epidermis that attaches to the nail is called the nail bed. That's the part of your finger that the fingernail is actually sitting on and is actually attached to. The nail matrix is a thickened part of the epidermis that's actually generating or creating those keratinocytes that are being smashed together to actually make the nail. Lunula is a white semilunar, looks a little bit like a half moon, area of the nail body because you have a thickened layer of the epidermis there, specifically the stratum basale, which makes it harder to see the pink coloring of the hemoglobin down in the blood vessels of the dermis. Okay, let's move on and talk about hair. Hair in the integument, also formed by keratinocytes being crushed together. Here, you're going to have a structure made of epithelial tissue called a follicle. So follicles are made of epithelial tissue, but they're located in the regions of the dermis or the hypodermis. So we have three distinct regions of a hair follicle. We have a hair bulb, we have a hair root, and we have a hair shaft. Now, it's important to recognize when people think, or I should say, people often confuse root with bulb. Let's cut to the picture because I think it'll be a little bit more clear. So the hair bulb, this is where the hair is actually being created. So the bulb and the root are two different things. The root is the entire portion of the hair that's underneath the skin. And the shaft is the portion of the hair that extends outwards beyond the surface of the skin. So hair follicle is the tissue surrounding the hair itself. The fancy word for a hair is pili. Right? A pilum is one hair and it's surrounded by a follicle. So the erector pili muscle is the muscle that erects the pili, the pilus meaning the hair. So this is a muscle that makes your hair stand up on end. This is what's going to cause goosebumps. So if you're exposed to cold temperatures or if you're having an extreme emotional reaction like fear or rage, right, these muscles will be activated and then your hairs will stand up on end. Just like when a dog or cat gets super angry, right, they puff themselves up. It's the exact same thing in humans. It's just humans are don't have a whole lot of hair, so it's less noticeable. Okay, here's the picture that I've been promising you guys. Down here where the hair is created at the deepest part of the follicle, this is the hair bulb. This is not the root, this is the bulb. The bulb is the deepest portion. The root is the entire portion of the hair that is located inside the skin, while the shaft is the part that extends beyond the surface of the skin. Notice that the follicle is made out of epithelial tissue. If you look at the structure of the follicle itself, you can see it has this outer sheath, a cuticle, and then deep to that, you're going to have the cortex of the hair itself. Let's see here. This particular image, right? Well, this scanning electron micrograph image just shows you a hair extending out from the surface of the skin. So these are going to be your dead keratinocytes, those squamous cells, and you can see they're flat plate-like dead cells. They give us that nice watertight barrier. Not a whole lot more to say there. Or you can kind of see how those keratinocytes are all smashed together to make the hair itself. So you start to see a little bit of that structure. Okay, this image here is showing you the details in the hair bulb itself. So this part down here where the hair is being created, we can see it in here. So what this stain is doing is epithelial tissue is shown in red and connective tissue is shown in blue. And you can see in the center of this hair bulb, right, you see a big old chunk of connective tissue, right? That blue area, or this chunk of connective tissue inside the hair bulb, is called the hair papilla. Remember, papilla is like a finger-like projection. Because it is a finger-like projection of connective tissue reaching up inside the hair bulb. Surround is going to be epithelial tissue, which gives rise to the keratinocytes, which get smashed together to actually make the hair itself. Now, the reason I point this out is I want you to think a little bit, right? Go back to those, what are the basic characteristics of connective tissue versus epithelial tissue? Excuse me. Epithelial tissue is avascular. Connective tissue does have blood vessels, right? The cells right here need to divide very, very rapidly. They're going to have a high metabolic rate because they're growing and they're dividing, they're growing and they're dividing in order to smash together and make all the body of the hair. Those cells are going to be very hungry because they have a very high metabolic rate. So they're going to need to have close access to connective tissue, which has a blood supply to feed all those rapidly dividing cells. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about hair management, and we can see how our anatomy applies to this. What is shaving? Shaving is you basically take a big blade and you just drag it across the surface of your skin. It can kind of hurt because you have a big, nasty, at the microscopic level, even the sharpest razor has a big kind of jagged edge, and it's going to start ripping off certain layers of your stratum corneum. It will also break the shaft off right at the surface. How long does shaving last? Not very long, a day or two, right? For some people, you know, you're talking like 8 hours before you start getting, you know, stubbly action going on. That's because you've only removed the shaft. You haven't done anything to what's going down here in the hair bulb, right? These cells are still dividing, they're still being crushed to make hair, and the whole thing is being extruded out from the surface of your skin, and it lasts a matter of hours. Now, a little bit more invasive technique, tweezing or waxing, which is more or less the same thing. Basically what you're doing there is you're going to grab onto the shaft and you're going to rip out as much of the hair as you possibly can, right? That doesn't feel too good either because now you're starting to damage deeper structures in the skin. However, if you pluck your eyebrows or you wax or something like that, right, how long does that last? That lasts significantly longer because you might take out most of the shaft and you might even disrupt a little bit of the hair bulb. So assuming you don't destroy the hair bulb, that then takes a greater amount of time before it grows grows, 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 and then sticks out from the surface of the skin. So that buys you a little bit more time. Now, what's the real fancy thing to do, right? The real fancy thing to do is go get laser hair removal. So what's going on with that? What's going on with laser hair removal? Well, lasers have become very sort of fancy and advanced these days, and what they can do is they can control the depth of focus of the laser. So what they can do is have the light be unfocused, pass through superficial layers of your tissue, pass through your epidermis, pass through a significant amount of your dermis, and then they can bring the laser light to an intense focus where it deposits all of its energy right here in the hair bulb. Specifically, it's targeting the hair papilla. If you take a laser and focus all the energy in the hair papilla, it will cauterize, it will cook, it will destroy the connective tissue in the hair papilla. You destroy the hair papilla, you destroy the blood vessels that are servicing the hair follicle. Now, when this hair follicle, these epithelial cells, they lose the hair papilla, they lose their source of nutrients, they can no longer grow. If they can no longer grow, you don't have any hair. Poof, right? Permanent fix to hair. Or you can damage the follicle in such a way that if it does grow back, it's much finer and softer than it was before, right? But these are the mechanisms, you know, now we know how they work based on the structure of hair follicles. One other thing I should point out here is the erector pili muscle. You can see it's going to attach from the follicle back to an epidermal ridge. Right. If I asked you to make this particular hair on your arm stand up on end, you couldn't do it. Right. That tells you something. That tells you that it's not skeletal muscle. Because if it was skeletal muscle, you would have conscious control over it, and you could do just that. It's obviously not your heart, so that only leaves one basic type of muscle. The erector pili is smooth muscle. You have involuntary control over it. It's controlled by your autonomic nervous system, right? Maybe, you know, the sound of my voice, or that creepy person behind you in an elevator or something like that, or something you really find kind of annoying, which is sort of like my lecture voice that I was jokingly talking about. It will basically activate your autonomic nervous system. It causes the smooth muscle of your erector pili muscle to contract, and that will cause your hair to stand up on end. You don't have conscious control over it. Okay. Functions of hair. Protection. Now, we'll talk a little bit of some examples of how hair protects you. Human beings are a little unusual, right? Because we don't have a whole lot of hair, right? We're very unusual. If you look at almost any other mammal, lots and lots of hair. In fact, our closest evolutionary neighbor, the chimpanzee, still has a lot of hair, but it has much less hair than all other mammals. If we have time, I might talk a little bit about why that might be. But anyway, hair serves an important protection, important function in protection, like eyebrows. Why do we have eyebrows? It's kind of weird if you think about it. Why is all this bald, but then we have a little bit of hair here? Well, the main function of eyebrows is actually to direct sweat out of the eyes, right? That can be a really big deal. Like nowadays, it's like a fashion statement, but 60,000 years ago, when there are like huge predators running after us, you better run, otherwise you're going to be dinner for some, you know, lion or something like that. And if you're running, which takes a lot of effort, and you sweat a lot, and that sweat gets into your eyes and you can't see where you're going, you trip over a rock, you're done, you're lunch. So making sure sweat doesn't pull in the eye really is a big deal. Also, eyelashes. Eyelashes are very, very, very sensitive. If anything even just lightly touches them or even comes near them, boom, they close shut. They help your eyelids close shut. So that helps protect these very, very sensitive areas. Heat retention, right? We have lots of hair on the top of our head, right? That helps keep us just a little bit warm. Sensory reception, I kind of talked about that, right? The eyelids, but also, right? If you touch a single hair on your arm, can you feel it? Yeah, you can, because there's another sensory receptor called a root hair plexus. We'll talk about that later, but you have a bunch of nerve endings around each of your hair follicles, and it's very, very sensitive. If you touch a single hair on your arm, you can feel it. Visual identification, right? Not to get too far into this, but human beings are very, very visual animals. We can communicate a tremendous amount of information just through facial expressions, and hair definitely helps with that. Also, without getting too far into things, when you start talking about sort of displays of sexual maturity and facial hair and all that kind of stuff, and it can help identify, what life stages individuals are in. Don't really have time to get into that. Chemical signal dispersions, right? Hair serves as an excellent means for getting chemical signals into the air. So what am I talking about are pheromones. So think of the places in the body that are hairy, and quite a few of them tend to be a little bit stinky or a little bit smelly. And that is for a reason, because it's a way for human beings to communicate with each other chemically. So groin, armpits, places like that, or places you have hair, you also generate a lot of the characteristic odors that people have. And this is anatomy, and it's a little gross to talk about, but it's a way to get those chemical signals into the air. Sweat evaporates off the hair, carries the chemicals into the surrounding atmosphere. People around you can smell it, and they can pick up on chemical signals based on that. Okay, moving on, let's talk about exocrine glands of the skin. Two basic types of exocrine glands. Remember, glands are derived from epithelial tissue, and exocrine glands specifically, whenever they create something, they're going to dump it into a tube or a duct. So our two types are sudoriferous glands. It's just a fancy word for a sweat gland. We're going to find we have two types of sudoriferous gland. We have what are called merocrine glands, sometimes called eccrine, and we have apocrine glands. So two different subtypes of sweat glands, sudoriferous glands. Our second type is what's going to be called a sebaceous gland. These are oil glands, and they're going to be associated with hair follicles. Okay, first up, merocrine or eccrine sweat glands. These are the most common in the body, and they're found everywhere, all over the place, but they're found in very high concentrations on the face and on the hands. So they're a simple coiled tubular glands. Their product, or their secretion, is mainly water. So mostly clear water, a little bit of salts, and they're controlled by the nervous system, right? Lots of them on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. So maybe you've been driving along the freeway and you see those billboards saying, cure for sweaty palms, right? So what they're actually doing, what they're actually going to do there, they're not going to individually zap those sudoriferous glands. What they're actually going to do is sever the connection of your nervous system to those glands. If your nervous system can't get the signal to those glands to activate, then they won't turn on, and then you won't produce sweat. So that's actually how that procedure works or is designed. So really the main function of the merocrine sweat glands is temperature regulation, right? So you're going to produce this fluid. It's sent via duct to the surface of the skin. There it evaporates from the surface of the skin and takes heat along with it, and allows for cooling. Also, it allows for secretion. Other compounds, hormones and things like that, not hormones, pheromones can be released through sweat by this mechanism. And also protection. Anyone who's done like running or endurance sports, sweat actually acts as a lubricant, right? It helps prevent chafing and abrasion. So sweating a lot will actually help with running and things like that. It helps prevent abrasion. Apocrine sweat glands are also simple coiled tubular glands, except the lumen, or the space of those tubes, is usually much, much larger than merocrine glands. And also apocrine glands are only found in particular parts of the body, places like your armpits, around the areola, which is the area immediately around the nipple. in the groin area and around the anus. So most of these, just to help you remember, you find apocrine sweat glands mostly in the stinky parts of your body. Now, granted, the areola is not stinky, but just to kind of help you remember that apocrine sweat glands are found in very specific regions of the body: armpits, groin, anus, and areola. Now, these are different. They are going to produce a fluid that is thick and cloudy and has a very large number of lipids and proteins. So lots of protein and lots of fats. That is distinctly different than what we saw from the watery secretions of the eccrine sweat glands. If you think about it for a second, if you don't shower and you get stinky, where are you stinky? You're stinky in your armpits. The reason why you're stinky in your armpits and other places is because that is where you have apocrine sweat glands. That is where those glands are producing lots of proteins and lots of lipids, and that serves as food for bacteria. The bacteria living in that part of your body are going to consume those lipids, consume those proteins, and they're going to make, via fermentation and other processes, kind of foul smelling byproducts. And again, if you just think for a second, this makes sense, right? When you go work out, right, you jump on a recumbent bike or you get on a treadmill, you take a few laps around the track, you work up a sweat. As soon as you're done working out, do you stink? Probably not. At least if you didn't stink before you started working out, immediately when you're done working out, you don't smell so bad, right? You're like, oh, I'm fine, no problem, I'm good to go, right? If you skip that shower, 5-8 hours later, do you start stinking? Yeah, you're going to smell real bad. And the reason is, when you first start sweating, these glands are going to release the proteins and fats, and they just sit there, but it's no big deal because the secretion doesn't smell bad in and of itself. However, the microorganisms living on your skin, you give them a few hours to start consuming this protein, they're going to start breaking it down into their metabolic waste products. Those things are going to smell. So, not a pleasant dinner conversation, but hey, that's what happens when you take a biology class. Okay, so this is a nice slide showing you some of the differences between the merocrine or equine sweat glands and an apocrine sweat gland. Notice that the lumen, or the space of the tube of the apocrine sweat glands, are much, much bigger. Also, if you saw a picture of the entire gland all by itself, you would see that apocrine sweat glands are larger than the eccrine sweat glands. So eccrine sweat glands found all over the body, but especially high concentration: forehead, face, palms, feet. Apocrine sweat glands found in those stinky areas, plus around the areola. These are the ones producing the liquidy, sort of milky secretion that has lots of proteins and lipids, which feed bacteria, which leads to the smell. Now, sebaceous glands, right, our second type of exocrine gland, these produce an oily substance called sebum. So the sebaceous glands are associated with the hair follicle, and they dump the sebum into the hair follicle, and this serves to lubricate the pilum of the hair inside the follicle, and the oil will extend up to the surface of the skin, out the hair follicle, and help protect, moisturize the skin. Now, sebaceous glands are inactive during childhood, but they become active, or much more active, during puberty. So that's why your teenagers, they stink. Because when they're little kids tend not to smell so bad because their sebaceous glands are not active. As soon as they hit 12 or 13, 11, 12, 13 years of age, sebaceous glands activate, they start producing sebum. Sebum is then consumed, because it's an oil, it's a fat, it starts getting consumed by microorganisms, and it starts producing a smell. Now, one thing I do want to say here, this is actually a good thing, because the majority of the microorganisms living on and inside your skin are good. They're healthy. They keep you safe, because these organisms don't cause you any problems. They just occupy that space. They occupy the environment. When a pathogen tries to come in, there's no space for it. There's no room, because all these other microorganisms are kind of fighting over space, and they prevent some pathogen from coming in, taking over, and making you sick. So believe it or not, having a rich, diverse microbial community on your skins actually helps prevent you from getting sick. Recent research has actually shown that for purposes of health, only showering maybe once every other day, once every 3 days will actually keep you a little bit healthier than showering every single day. Now, obviously, I'm not suggesting any changes to personal habits, but just so you're aware, this is really part of our microbiome. It's a natural defense against pathogens, and it's a good thing. It's generally not an issue unless you have somebody who's got, you know, OCD issues, is washing their hands 15 times a day. They're going to remove all the oil, right? Their hands may dry out and crack. That makes, you know, their environment is more sterile. It's easier for pathogens to get access. They're going to be more likely to get infections. Not a huge, massive factor, but just something to be aware of. Okay, so here we have a nice figure showing our eccrine, or American sweat gland. Notice that it's relatively small in size, and it has a duct that leads all the way to the surface of the skin. Here we have a sebaceous gland, which is part of the hair follicle. Its sebum is dumped directly into the hair follicle itself, and that's how it makes its way to the surface. This picture of an apocrine sweat gland is not quite perfect. This gland should be much bigger than the American sweat gland. And it shows that the lumen is a little bit bigger than the American gland. These lumens should be quite a lot larger. One thing I should point out, and notice that the apocrine gland, its duct does not go directly to the surface of the skin, excuse me, like the American gland did. Its duct actually connects to the hair follicle. So apocrine sweat glands, they're the ones making the oils and the proteins. That actually gets sent to the follicle, and from the follicle, it reaches the surface of the skin. Only the American gland goes all the way to the surface of the skin on its own. Over here, we have 3 examples of histological slides. American sweat gland, notice this is a fairly small lumen. Apocrine sweat gland is a larger lumen. This isn't a great picture. That's why I included this in the notes, so you can really see the difference. Down here, this is a sebaceous gland associated with hair follicles. If we had a close-in zoom of that, the cells in the sebaceous gland look like adipocytes, big white empty cells, except the sebaceous glands have a centrally located nucleus. Adipocytes did not. Their nuclei are pushed off to the side. So don't confuse sebaceous glands with adipocytes. Sebaceous glands, centrally located nucleus. Hepatocytes, the nucleus is pushed off to the side. So this is a very nice table summing up the differences between the different types of exocrine glands. One that I have, or actually I say 2 that I have not mentioned yet, mammillary glands, right? The glands that produce milk. We'll talk about those in the last day of class when we cover reproductive. And ceruminous glands. These are glands that you have in your ear canal, your external acoustic meatus, right, which produce wax, or produce a material called cerumen, which we refer to as earwax. It's very similar to sebaceous glands. But go ahead and take a look at that, get a little summary of the different types of glands, and that brings us to the end of our lecture on the integumentary system. I have one more interesting side fact to share with you guys. But I have spent so much time talking about interesting side facts, like where does the pigmentation of the skin come, and the whole lecture about melanoma and understanding its molecular, cellular, and tissue-related whole thing. I don't want to spend any more time on this lecture because this lecture has got a lot longer than it normally would have. So if you want to know the cool story about sudoriferous glands, and how they help us become the dominant predator on the planet, talk to me during the Zoom session, and I'll explain all of that there. But that brings us to the end of the material on the integumentary system. Most lectures are not going to have so many tangents, but there's so many interesting things to talk about the integumentary system. I definitely wanted to include a few of them. So with that, I'll sign off, and we'll see you guys in the Zoom session. Take care.